curtain hand's glimmer made you shine and shimmer. Shifting its light to glitter, slowly you fade. Fractures can sometimes be identified. How do you see the cracks that happen? Would it be rough, irregular, maybe shell-like, or smooth and curved, or maybe jagged, or sharp edges like broken metal, forming elongated splinters, or maybe breaking like clay or chalk? Our future is to live with bruises, uneven, hackly, splintery, earthy, sometimes brittle, sectile, malleable, flexible, elastic. Would we be able to resist the stress of the crushing, tearing, bending, breaking? Or would we be easily broken into powder by the cutting and hammering? Or could we be shaved with the knife to leave crumbs? Or would we be hammered into thin sheets like gold or copper? Or would we be bent to not return to our original form when the stress is released? Or would we be bent like a string only to return to the original form when stress is released? Our future will be, can be, definitely be with bruises, uneven, hackly, splintery, earthy, brittle, sectile, malleable, even flexible and elastic. But will we be able to resist the stress? As I did tanda so, my eyes they all touch light phone and north. As I did tanda so, I did look una for north. As I did tanda so, I did point for east. As I did tanda so, I did point for west. When they bring the thing, they come hit you anytime. You go feel the thing they do. You go see that no be easy one. As I did tanda so, my eyes they stay for north. As I did tanda so, I feel the thing they hurt. Waiting you go do as I did and so. I know say the thing they hurt as I did and so. Waiting you go do when they tell you say that this been where they hit, go hit you hard. Waiting you go do when they tell you say that this thing they do, they hit you hard as I did and so. I feel you as I did and so. I feel you hard.
Hi and welcome to the performance room. I'm very happy to be joined now for a conversation by Otobong Nkanga, whose incredible work we've just seen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine.
And thank you for joining us whilst you're still covered in the work.
Still covered with all the little bits and pieces, but
yeah, a mixture of
glitter.
Can we give away your trade secrets?
Yeah, there's no secret. Makeup, glitter, powder, all kinds.
Yeah, and this beautiful copper in your hair.
Oh yeah, that's a sculptural piece, but inspired from Nigerian hairstyles from the 60s and the 70s.
Looks fantastic. And I wanted to begin actually by asking you about minerals and stones and the title of the piece, Diaoptasia.
Yes.
This backdrop we've got is, I believe, the mining of a stone, dioptase. A close-up photo of that.
Well, it's a close-up photo of a space that I saw in Namibia, and it was one of the old mined areas, mined by the locals, not by the people that came in later on into Namibia. So it still has traces of like the hatched and the cutting into the rocks, and so I photographed that, and that's what's actually as the backdrop. Looking at everything that's in relation to fracturing, cutting, also how the stone itself goes through this process of taking out a mineral like diaptase or taking out azurite. It needs to be carved out. And the title of the work, Diaoptasia, is actually the dia, which is a double word, and a double something that you go through, or it goes through, and optasia is to view. And so it's not a word that exists, it's two words I put together called Diaoptasia. So, yeah.
And that, this kind of fascination with stones, you mentioned this beautiful story about how you came to collect stones, because in the research for this piece, you've had a book all about, that you said is your Bible.
It's my Bible.
You know, all the different stone and mineral and rock formations that you've been studying. But you said as a child you started this fascination with picking up stones.
Yeah, as a child, I mean, most times we were outdoors. So
you grew up in
Nigeria, in Lagos. And so you were outdoors, you played, and in those days, you know, you could still find rocks and things and mica on the road, but now, you know, there's a lot of construction, many things have been built, so It's not the same as how it used to be when we were kids. I used to find mica on the road and going to school, and it was one of those things I would put on my skin, and because my mother would not allow us to look at everything that was Diana Ross and all those flashy things in the 80s. So
you're making up for it now.
Yes, I'm making up for it now, partly, like having a bit of, but all these things come from, with time, you realize that a lot of things like this mica is in our makeup, it's in things that we use in isolation pads for irons in our buildings. So you start realizing that those little things you played with are actually part of our everyday life.
So, I mean, in your work, in the sculpture you make, in the performances, in drawing and other kinds of installation, you're often looking at these relationships between the body and the landscape and between, nature and culture in its broadest sense. What are the politics behind how you use stones?
I don't think it's really, if we have to think of it as politics, but I just think that all those things that tell us are really interconnected. When we look at if a landscape is damaged through mining or through processing or through war, all that affects also the psychological states of people. It affects nature. It's like a chain of effects. So it's not necessarily separated. The body is affected by it. For example, when I was in Namibia and there was this mining, the smelters melting copper, I entered the city, and after 3 days of being there, I realized that I had to spit a lot, or people were spitting and your throat is itching, and you realize that you're actually taking in arsenic and all this poisonous, so it's like invisible dust, but it affects also. So it's this kind of thing that is still connected, no matter what. The body is connected to it. When there is dust, you feel it, you sneeze. So that's how I relate to it, by just this tiny little gestures that happen through irritation in a landscape, or through connection in a landscape, or with a material or mineral or a space, Yeah,
and from there you're making these connections between the very primary materials and tertiary networks, I guess, of industry and trade and exchange. But there's also, I think, such a sense of magic. And I wondered, some of the ways that you've worked just now with the camera, appearing to, or, swallowing the stone, the hand gestures, this kind of sense of almost, performing a trick somehow. I wondered if the figure of the magician is something of interest to you.
I think there's also a part in relation to this which touches the magic. How do we, even when we don't believe in it, we're still constantly believing that if I wear a certain stone, it will heal me, or it might protect me from whatever. We still believe that when we wear certain things or we place certain things in our houses, that in a way it brings good luck. So we're still, even though it might be reduced in the way we deal with it in everyday life, but it's still part of this way of thinking of, this material will do something to me. So in a way, there's also that aspect that is looking not only at things that are very tangible and material, but I think there are aspects that I'm not even aware of, because I perform, I feel it. It's an instinct. But I'm not.
Because you were improvising at the end, weren't you?
Yeah, a lot of things are. The last part of the performance is very much improvised. It's very much. I wanted a space within this performance room where I could feel, try to feel something, sing a song to someone. Imagine someone out there, and try.
Yeah.
So it's
even
a way of
though
connecting.
we're in a space without an audience, it's performed to camera, which has maybe a kind of feeling of anonymity. Is there someone out there that you were singing to?
Yeah, there are people I'm singing to, and I think when I sing with like pidgin English, then it kind of excludes other people and includes other people. But in the way I was thinking about the work, I was just thinking of also how the language is also fractured when we have English language and all of a sudden it's been hacked, it's been broken, turned and then it becomes something else, which is also a way of resistance, I think, or a way of finding another solution to a language that maybe might not be to your own choice or you don't feel comfortable with it. So I think that kind of connection with the public, or choosing the public I'm singing to through language or through emotion, is one of those things I was thinking of in the third part.
Definitely. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about those three sections, actually, and also how you take a position from where I stand, I see you south, which is then echoed in the Pidgin English version afterwards.
Yes.
But you conceived the piece in three sections. Is there a story you're telling through those?
Well, I think it was like finding within the three parts how to layer different thoughts of the idea of a fractured space, the idea of a bruised space, and that fractured space might not necessarily be something that is negative, but it's looking at fracture through language, it's looking at the way of consuming something, and that takes a part of you, or the fracturing from the bits and pieces that come out of here into that. So it's like a fractured part of a bigger element. And here the second part is also looking at, through looking at landscape. Because I think when you film it, you don't really realize that it's on paper, printed, a photographic image. You might think it might be in a 3D in volume. But here we really feel the hatches in the wall, the cut. And also with the text that is used here is really using terms that are used for minerals. When you want to identify a mineral, has it been fractured, hacked, or sliced? Or has it gone through tension? So they're all these terms that are used as a body, but it comes in. So I take out the words mineral and ore, and use it in relation to our future, or use it in relation to our body. And then the third part is looking in Pidgin English as I tandasu, my eye, do torchlight you for una north. That means it's a way of saying that I will send a light to you in the north.
Wow, that's beautiful.
It's like torchlight. So you're down south and you're like torchlighting the north, and which is more or less the same thing as from where I stand, I see you south.
So it's really nice to orientate yourself that way within digital space somehow, to have that idea of a real north or a real south
exactly.
That's invoked, even if it's a fiction. I've got questions and comments coming in from quite a lot of people, actually. Okay. Domenico Olivero said, thank you to the intervention of performing, very beautiful. Jack Stockdale said, lovely. Leon Harris asked where the idea for the performance grew from, which we've talked about a little bit already. But Yvonne Lang asked, what's the role of language, namely for Pidgin English, in the work? And you've said a little bit about that already, but with the crushing, tearing, bending, breaking in the first part, I really felt you're using language as a material. And then why did you choose to juxtapose these two kinds?
I think like the Pidgin English is a language that has been broken, hacked, sliced. You would see like sabi, if you take the word sabi, she you sabi, you know. And that's a kind of Portuguese. When you start looking at the language, you start understanding the influences that have taken place within a culture. So Pidgin English is one of those extremely vibrant languages that within different parts of the world, when you go to the Caribbean or you're in West Africa, you start realizing that the words that are used are also incorporating all the other languages in it, and it's constantly shifting. So for you to change a language, to be able to make it a force, you have to hack it. You have to bruise it, you have to cut it, you have to slice it and add something else to it. You have to transform from hearing into form. And so for me, it still enters into the same thing as in relation to the landscape, in relation to the body, that it's still hacked and chopped. and it becomes something else. It transforms. So for me, the language was just part of a way of looking at multiple layers of thinking, landscape, body, voice, internal, external, skin. So you start building layers, and with that you start finding ways of expressing that in the work.
Yeah, and you do this very complicated confusion of interior and exterior that keeps shifting, the kind of depth space and surface space, I think, and the piercing of the object.
Yeah, the object had to die.
The object was sacrificed in the making of this work. There are quite a few questions here about performing not to a live audience. There's one from Daniel Pinheiro. What's the importance for you of performing this to an unknown live audience? Because you've said that you often draw on the energy of the live situation in other work that you've made.
Well, I think here it was quite difficult. I think my main issue was, who am I performing to? And I think that's one of the questions we also talked a lot about. And I had to create characters and find ways of like channeling an emotion towards a specific place or person, or but it's a big difference because you feel you just don't feel the energy of the people, but you have a different way of like rethinking it. I had to think of of multiple worlds, multiple people, and also within the content of what I'm making, what am I trying to say to the world? What am I putting out there? How am I placing different things together to make a narrative or non-narratives? But yeah, it's always different. I mean, yeah, it's different, definitely. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Will you use because you often work with framing devices architecturally, so here the camera became maybe another frame you were working with.
Yeah.
There was actually another question about that from Rafaela Davies, who wanted to know about using, about performance on video. Does it feel like less of a performance? I guess if you're using that frame as well, does it become filmmaking in a different way, video making? No, I don't think so. I think it's not less of a performance, it's just a different performance. And here, for example, a lot of times when you rehearse certain things, you have a camera in front of you before you even have a public. You kind of have a mirror also so that's not really a public, it's something you look at to learn how to move a certain gesture. So it almost feels like it's a study case for a performance, not yet the final performance. That's how it feels. But what I was interested with the framing and the camera was to think of ways of creating smoothness within a whole 3 chapters of a performance. So you create screens, you move them, you shift, you're into another space. So you're creating different worlds within the whole performance. And so that for me was something that it allows me to do it because you don't see me run around to get to the next stage. If there was a public, I wouldn't be able to run around. I would think differently of the performance. I wouldn't create it this way. It's true, because the set that you've set up with these screens, and you had these other parts on wheels, that one's gone now, where almost the room feels like a theatre set in a way, but it's one specifically geared to that window of the video. Jodie Liu asked a good question, I thought. How has the use of performance within your wider practice as an artist informed what you do? Was performance a starting point for you? Liveness or action?
Well,
because, in the sculpture and other forms of art that you make.
I think I've always kind of been in a mode of performativity or performance. But I never understood it as that. I just, you sing with your sister and your family, you do things and you realize while doing it that this is, wow, amazing, I'm making this. With a group of people having a voice within other voices. And performance has always been part of me, but I think once it entered into the artwork, then it becomes it's still part of me, but then I have to think a bit more on the gesture on the meaning of certain things, that you don't just go and, oh, but you really wonder, why do you even do that? And how? What does it mean? You start taking care on the little things or the little movements that you do to understand what is the power of that movement, or what is the power of that sound, or what is the power of the eye to look directly. So you start actually working on little details that before you would, do it and it doesn't really matter. But I think once you start mixing it with other things, other works, with thinking of in relation to photography, into body, into sculpture, then you have to be more precise and be extreme, understand what your body's saying, understand what your voice is saying, understand the energy you're giving out.
I really like the redistribution of value that you're creating in doing that. You're giving a look, the way you create a gaze or a gesture, as much weight and as much value as the rock sculpture that you've made, or the drawing, or so this new kind of ecology of relations in your work is great, I think. There's a question from 1212 who said, do you think that this is more in line with film? I guess this relates to the questions about how there's another question too about from Daniel Pinheiro again about channeling and how it relates to being in a networked society. But it's again about this format, I guess.
Yes, it's a format I chose. When I was thinking about it, I was really thinking also partly the way of framing, having the screens with the text on it. If I think of the 1920 films, how they kind of put text in front to be able to edit. Like, oh, tomorrow morning it will rain, or the lady comes out of the house and it comes with a text. And next thing you see the lady with that umbrella hopping out. And so for me, I was looking at this kind of ways of like, since I'm on this thing, I don't have a public, I was thinking it's interesting to think about it as a kind of short chapters in which you can think of how to live edit. Everything is live, so let's go into it. Live edit, live perform, all that. And so I had to think of different ways of working with that, and maybe it could end up looking like a film. I don't know what it looks like at the end of the day, I have no idea, but I would see it after. But I'm interested in this thing where you see the smoothness of things, that it jumps from this and you don't expect the next chapter, and the next chapter pops up, which I think film does in a very good way, that you kind of can go from one extreme, one end of the world, into another part of the world by just them cutting and putting you there to look at it and immerse yourself in it.
Right. There's one more question we've got time for, I think, from Rachel Ruby, who asked, was it intended to bring life and warmth to minerals and ores? And I thought maybe, could I add to that question? Could you say something a little bit more about how you think about stones and minerals in relation to the body, and your attitude to identity politics, which you've talked about a bit before?
Oh gosh, yeah. Okay, the way I look at, I learn a lot from just looking at minerals and looking at the way they're composed. For example, we might take a stone, and by the time we start looking at it, it's composed of iron, lithium, different minerals, oxygen, iron, all kinds of stuff. And then for me, when I look at it and I look at the relationship, the way we are in this world, and the idea of molecules and atoms, I look at the stone and it's composed of so many minerals or elements that should not be together. But all of a sudden, due to an external force, they're forced to be together. And it creates a different kind of identity for that stone. You look at it and it's a bit more red than the other because it has more iron. And then you start looking at that and you start thinking of how are we dealing with the way we are. We're meant to be different and we're meant to live together. And living together is also living together with a certain kind of tension. So even if within that stone, some parts might have cracked because that iron was too much there, but it still stays together. So for me, that relationship of looking at elements and how they cohabit or how one eats the other, or how one takes over and reshapes. It's still part of the way of thinking of identity and how we should be dealing with identity. And for me, I think it's something that the institution has built a way of people looking at each other. And that institution have influenced individual people to react in a certain way to certain people. But I feel that if we are able to work with the different institutions that have built this kind of ways in which they have been passed by from generation to generation in our different educations, that is where the change can happen. But once we're constantly attacking each other, we haven't yet touched the core of where the problem is, and the institutions continue dealing with it, continue the same way, and it's perpetrated down the lane. So
you're
I think,
making, sorry, Karen.
Yes, I think the minerals somehow, when I look at it and start looking at the composites and the structure and how they fight, they've been melted, heated, transformed to be that, I'm just like, yeah, I take each element and decide, okay, this is that, what if, what will happen? Yeah.
So actually the question was whether you bring life to minerals, but actually you're kind of seeing all of life in these rocks and stones as this metonym of kind of the wider society.
Yeah, I think we cannot separate it from the wider society. I think it's something that we learn from. You learn from the fractals, you learn from plants, you learn from, and when you sit down and just have them there for a second and observe them and think about them in a different way than just like it's a stone, but think about them in its kind of community of what it contains, I think then you're able to like kind of place it on the same way as we're working with humans and thinking of humans and how we're dealing with sliced and cut landscapes and neighborhoods and separations and architectures and forms and
It's extraordinary how you've grown a whole universe from there.
a little stone.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk, as well as for the amazing and beautiful work. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Really great.
And thank you everybody for sending in questions. We are broadcasting another performance from next week with Nafis Ramirez Figueroa, so please do watch. Thank you.